Welcome everybody. My name's Paul Dobson. I'm a professor in the business school. I'm delighted to say I work with colleagues across UEA and external partners for the Norwich Institute of Healthy Aging. I'm delighted to be able to host and chair this seminar today. The theme is going to be around mobility, and we have two speakers. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Charles Musselwhite from Aberystwyth University. And the second speaker will be our own Wendy Hardeman who's a professor in HSC. So Charles is going to be talking about transport and mobility in later life, and it's more than getting from A to B. And Wendy will be presenting some work that she's been doing on the PROPELS trial, giving us an intervention to promote sustained increase in physical activity for an at-risk population. We're delighted to host Charles. He can't be here in person, so he's still online and still based in Wales. Charles has recently moved to Aberystwyth University to take up a chair there. His background is in psychology, so I'm sure he's got a lot to tell us about how psychology works for encouraging mobility in later life. The plan for today will be to let Charles present, and he says he's going to take 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to offer it up for questions. I've left the chat function open, so if you have any questions, it might be helpful to me to write those questions down, so I will scroll through the chat list to see what questions there are and invite audience participation at that point. After that, I'm going to hand over to Wendy, who's going to give us a presentation which will take 10 minutes or so, and again open up the chat function to have any questions that Wendy is prepared to take. We're scheduled to finish at 1:15, so I will try and keep everybody to time and make sure we do that. And just remind everybody that if we don't, then we don't get our lunch. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Charles and welcome you, Charles. It's nice to see you.
Thank you very much. I'll just start by doing what everyone always does at the moment in these meetings. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. So here we go. And let me know if you can see that all right. Does that look okay? So that's my presentation for today. Delighted to be here with you, albeit not in person. I was saying to the panel earlier on, I'm a bit disappointed not to be in Norwich because I love visiting the Waffle House in Norwich, and I haven't been there for years, so I was looking forward to coming to that, but I'll just have to make my own waffles when this meeting finishes. So I'm Charles Musselwhite. As Paul said, I've got a recent chair in psychology at Aberystwyth University. There's Aberystwyth University at the top of the screen. And there's some of the older people I've worked with at the bottom of the screen. You can see Aberystwyth, beautiful place, a lot more hilly than you're used to perhaps in Norwich. But of course, Norwich, no less beautiful, of course. But, you know, one thing I want to make sure is that as we age, we can still visit these places that we like to be able to go to. How do we enable older people to be able to visit somewhere as beautiful as Aberystwyth, despite the hills and things like that? I've had about 15-20 years of research into mobility, perhaps 15 years or so looking at mobility in terms of an aging population, and I just wanted to present for you today some of the bits and bobs or snippets of research findings that I've carried out over that time that really have shown me how important mobility is for older people and how it is much more than just a means to an end. It's much more than just going to you know, visit something or go out and do something. The journey itself is important, and other elements related to mobility are important in it all as well, and I'll go through those in a little bit. Now, of course, the desire to get out and about as we age doesn't diminish. You know, why should it do in later life? We might change the patterns of mobility that we do, less likely to have to travel as much for work, although lots of older people working later in life than ever before. Leisure travel goes up a little bit, particularly in younger, older age, so from sort of 65, 70 plus. But you know, the variety of activities we want to do are still things that we want to do. We're probably living more dispersed lives than we've ever done, probably worked in lots of different places, maybe living away from family and friends. So mobility is high, and it's probably the highest it's ever been amongst older people at the moment. But as well as a society where we've got more older people, we've got more older people who are more mobile. And also coupled to that, they're more likely to drive than previous generations have done before. So we've got a highly mobile, highly population that's driving a lot. And we know that being mobile is very important for health. It's related very much to well-being and physical health in that, so mental and physical health. And we know that particularly giving up driving is related to a decrease in well-being, increase in depression and other related health problems. And that's, you know, that's when you can separate out the cause and effect as best you can from research. So it's led researchers to talk about it as a major life event, and we will need to know a little bit why. Lots of research talks about people not being able to access things being crucial to that. So, you know, 1 in 10 people over the age of 70 feel trapped in their own homes through lack of transport. After they give up driving, can't access supermarkets, can't access post office, and can't access healthcare services and things like that. And of course, that's really important. But I wanted to move beyond that and talk a little bit about other elements of transport. It isn't just about getting to these places at the end of the day, although that, of course, is crucial to that. I was just going to investigate these elements for you all today. So I wanted to look at transport and mobility in terms of more psychological or affective reasons and aesthetic reasons alongside that. That places are not just utilitarian, the journey itself is important, and the destination might involve elements of the journey. It's blurred lines, it's not quite as distinct as it might seem. When we're planning for things for people after they give up driving or alongside driving, the infrastructure that helps people stay connected to things is important, the roads, the streets and things like that. But it's also beyond infrastructure, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It's not just infrastructure on its own. We can't just build something and expect people to use it. We've got to take into account the psychology and things like that. I think we've got an ageist transport environment, and I'll show some examples of that and why that matters. And then considering overall of that, is the journey itself really necessary, needs to be asked, particularly in this day and age of sustainability and pollution problems and things like that. You know, if we just kept people traveling later on in life as much as they traveled throughout their life, is that really appropriate? Can we replace it by different means? And if so, how do we do that? And also, what do you miss if you don't replace literal journeys with other literal mobility solutions? I'll talk a bit about that. Then just to come up with the idea of how we move this forwards, to think about transport very much as a people-based element and how we involve older people in that before coming to a conclusion. That sound like a plan for everyone? Hope so. Mobility is about getting from A to B, but it's also about psychosocial and aesthetic issues. So this was a nice diagram that I developed with Heba Haddad over 10 years ago now. So I published it about 11 years ago in the first instance. I revisited that recently. So when I did some research with older people and I talked to them in person and got them to do some diaries about their journeys, I asked them, you know, why do you travel? What's important to you to travel? And then the bottom level of those needs comes out time and time again. The need to get from A to B as safely, reliably, comfortably, as cheaply as possible. And that comes out very much when you first talk to people. So that is important. But the more I badgered them about why they went about their mobility journeys and got them to write about their mobility journeys and to reflect and think about them, then these other two levels of needs appear. So I put them in a hierarchy because they're not all appear to people at the first instance. And I think that's important when we think about how we plan for mobility, particularly for people once they've given up driving, that you've got to take into account these three levels of needs. And if you only take into account what comes to people's minds in the first instance, you only plan around the practical and utilitarian purposes. But really what came out from talking to older people was that their social or affective needs are important as well, that mobility gives them a sense of independence, a sense of control. It's linked to Status, particularly in families, head of the household or helping other people complete their journeys. So that status, that roles, something about their identity, related even to self-esteem, something about saying something about themselves to other people. They're still fit and well enough, for example, to drive. And then also, when you badger them enough and ask them again and again, these other elements of mobility come out that I've called aesthetic needs. So things like kinesthetic mobility, the need to feel that you're being mobile, to actually experience the mobility yourself. There's immersive mobility as well, to travel through beautiful surroundings, and imaginative mobility, so positioning yourself in relation to other people's mobility and watching the world go along around you. And I'll come on to that in a little bit. And the car's really important. When I talk to older people about giving up driving, these are the things that they miss. And again, they first talk about the practical and utilitarian needs, that they can't access things that they once did. So that's why they feel more depressed or isolated from things. It can lead to health problems, so less frequent healthcare use, for example, and mental health, so reduced social networks and that kind of thing. But also that it affects your affective needs, that people just didn't feel like they belonged anymore. There was lots of things about the car being very normal and ordinary, and the fact that you give that up meant that it was, somebody said to me, it was their first step towards the scrap heap of life, that they weren't able to drive anymore. It was a symbol that they were too old to participate in ordinary everyday life, which is very sad and poignant. And I think that those things need to be taken into account when we're thinking about helping people perhaps give up driving and think about mobility beyond the car. And the top level of needs comes into play as well, that the car allows people to take longer journeys than they would perhaps by other modes. So people gave examples of going to perhaps a healthcare appointment and getting difficult news or sometimes relieving news, but then wanting to drive a long way home through the forest or something like that. Or even they just told me about having days out. They wanted days out down by the coast or down by the beach, hard to do by public transport, much easier to do by car, and that they could choose when and where to go and things like that. So they could feel part of the world going on around them, and that was important to people. Building on that final element, I did some more research into the need for what I think transport planners are often called discretionary travel, that it's not seen as very important. Look, you can easily allow people to do mobility, to do important things like go to the doctors, go to the dentist, go to the bank and things like that. But when you think about journeys that people make, that only makes up a small amount of journeys, and certainly the desired journeys that people want to do. Older people want to take part in leisure, they want to go out and see things. Why wouldn't they? But I'm amazed by just how many suggestions of providing transport beyond the car don't take into account going out for just a journey, perhaps to see life going on. So lots of people talked about, the end product being discretionary, going to the pub, going to the theatre, going to the cinema, having opportunities to do that, really important, and how public transport didn't allow for that because of the particular time of day. Community transport not always providing for that, although there were some excellent examples where people could use community transport to go and do these journeys. But also really importantly, that the journey itself is important. Happiness isn't always at the end of the road, it's on the road itself, really, as well. And people talked about, just sitting on a journey and seeing life go along past them, seeing the view. Somebody put a great quote there that they really liked when they could drive because it takes you where you don't need to go, and that's for them was life. You don't have to have an end product in ID. You can set off without any end destination in mind and just drive through the countryside and see where it's going. You can just do that on a whim as well. But it's not all just the car. People talked about the bus and public bus and community transport being a third space in itself, that people use that as a place to chat, to meet people, to see the same people every week, that kind of thing. So there's something important about the journey to capture there as well, beyond the destinations. I think, like I said, we construct the outside. When we think about giving up driving, we construct things to help people beyond driving really poorly. Some examples here from where we go in terms of pedestrian and walking and things like that. So what comes out lots of times from my work with older people is the need for benches to be able to stop and sit, or to be able to place a bag down and put things in and take things out. But you know, it's not just lack of benches, it's also when we provide benches, they're either very uncomfortable, like the one on the left hand side, and a terrible view of an overgrown hedge, or they place them in the wrong locations. The one on the right hand side is from Porthcawl in Wales, and you've got the lovely sea view behind it that people could sit and look, it's facing the other way, which actually faces the road. The council got away with that by saying that's the world's first selfie bench, so people could sit on there and take a selfie and have the sea behind them, but actually they put them in the wrong way round. And so many times you can see from those benches there, they're not the most comfortable places. There's nowhere to help people get up and sit down with armrests and things like that, or if they are, they're really poor quality or not particularly thought about. And you know, that actually does stop older people going out and about, or choosing a very different destination, or choosing a different place that does have benches or somewhere to stop. And the same happens with toilets. Another study I did a few years ago, and other people have done similar things and found similar results, is that older people don't walk fast enough for the Department for Transport's liking. So only about 12% of older people walk at the recommended speed across crossings that the Department for Transport mandates. So you're supposed to walk at 1.2 meters per second. No one can identify where that number comes from or why that's been set the way it is. Somebody talked about possibly coming from a master's thesis at Yale in 1950s. But now that speed is used across the world as what you set your traffic lights at to allow people to cross the road before they turn back to green for the traffic to come the other way. And as I say, I found 12% of people over the age of 65 couldn't walk at that speed, or didn't walk at that speed actually across a crossing. And even worse for females, only 6% of females walked across the crossing at that speed. Interestingly, it was faster if people came from, I intercepted them after they'd done the journey and collected some background detail, and it was faster if they came from a higher socioeconomic background. I don't know what that says. So people walk faster across the crossing and march across it if they're posh at the end of the day. I think that's it. There are some changes to this now. You get crossings that have infrared, so they don't turn back to green for the cars to pass until people have completed the crossing. But interestingly, for some unknown, well, there is a reason, but it's not the greatest of reasons, you lose the green man ahead of you on those kind of crossings. And again, that makes older people crossing less confident about crossing. They like to be able to see that they're still on green, or if it turns to red, that they have to be a little bit more vigilant. But on these particular crossings with infrared, you've only got the green man on the right hand side at the button that you press to cross the road. And that was designed so that you'd look towards the traffic that was coming on the carriageway coming towards you in the first instance. But it makes people very anxious, particularly older people who got very used to crossing and use the green man to help them confidently finish the crossing. And the most common issue is about poor quality pavements. If there is pavements at all, it's about them being badly upkept. It's about them being not looked after, particularly in bad weather where there's leaves or ice on them, about the paving not being very good, about blistered surfaces not being put in properly or looked after, and really crucial to at the bottom left there, having obstructions on the pavements, whether that's parked cars or bins or too much clutter going on, meaning people have to walk out into the road around it. And all these elements, I have examples of where older people have told me, or they've kept in diaries themselves, that it stopped them going out, particularly if they're not feeling very confident that day or not feeling very stable on their feet, that it makes a difference to where they go, or sometimes taking the longer route round. So we've really got to think about changing that. And it does make a difference to the road traffic collision rates, if you like, for older people. We talk lots about older drivers being dangerous. They're not, by the way. That's another seminar to do at another time. But what really is striking is a huge increase in the number, particularly if you look in the bottom diagram, female pedestrians being overrepresented in casualties per billion journeys, as the diagram is there. As a pedestrian on the road, a huge increase in that needs to be looked at. I mean, if we're creating an environment where people can't go walking because they fear, and actually have examples of them falling and being seriously injured, then we've got a big problem ahead there. Regardless of frailty, regardless of the makeup or composition of these things, we need to make sure we create a safe environment for older people. I just want to emphasize as well that it's not just about provision of infrastructure. That's really important, but it can be overcome. I did a study a couple of years ago again with Teresa Scott from Queensland University in Australia, where we mapped people's journeys in different types of capital and how they traded those capitals between each other. So building on Bourdieu's capitals theory, we were found that infrastructure is really important, and probably the most important thing. Getting that right helps people walk in a way that keeps them safe, but also that can be helped or hindered by social capital, or it can be helped or hindered by cultural capital. So things like social norms, whether walking was seen as normal or not in that environment. We had lots of older people telling us, oh, I don't really like going walking on my own down this particular position. You think, why is that? Is that because it's not very safe, or because it's dark down there? No, I just don't feel right doing it. I don't feel, if I had a dog, it would be all right to go walking down that place, but I don't feel I can walk in that zone. So particularly in urban areas, particularly in areas that weren't particularly very beautiful, people didn't feel that they were able always to go for a walk. It looked odd and unusual. And I think that's a real shame, but social norms play a big part in all of that. Consequently, also, so family and friend support can help people in that social way as well. So if you didn't have very good infrastructure, going for a walk with somebody else who can help you physically and mentally do that walk really helped. In terms of cultural capital, you've got those norms and expectations, what's expected of people in those areas. Do we provide things for people to be able to do walking? Is it expected and normal in that? And that varies hugely in different places, different spaces. So that all impacts together. So it's important to think of infrastructure, but it on its own, without thinking about those wider concepts, probably doesn't do it a disservice on it all. And really overarching, that transport environment we create for older people, I always say, is very ageist. You only need to look at the sign to realize that, you're creating an environment where older people, elderly people, are said in this, on this sign, is seen as something negative, something that you have to be wary of or careful around. Now, it's probably good reason to put this sign in place. They're often around, residential homes. But I did a small study on a desktop simulator with drivers to see if it made any difference to their driving, and that sign doesn't make any difference whatsoever. So having warnings for other things, speed limits, having warnings there's a corner coming up, having warning there might be ice on the road, all meant people took vigilance and made a difference. This one didn't make any difference to people's driving behavior at all. So is there any need to have it in the environment, let alone how the negative image that portrays? Although somebody did point out to me, it looks like the female on the picture, who's of course walking behind the man, is pickpocketing the gentleman walking out ahead of that with a stick. But we need to change that. I mean, there have been some examples of trying to change that. There's some from a campaign a few years ago. The Centre for Aging Better is developing some new signage for it all as well. But that doesn't depict the older people I work with at the end of the day, and it does matter. If you look at some of the studies out there, stereotypes matter. This was one just done on driving behavior, for example. If you sort of prime people to have that stereotype in their mind before they do a driving test or a simulated driving test online, they make more mistakes. So if you've got that in your concept around you all the time of that negative stereotypical image, then people are going to make errors and mistakes all the time. And then it's worth considering, is the journey from A to B really necessary at all? And again, from a study a few years ago, we looked at how many times, literal mobility was thought about in terms of helping people's mobility in later life. But when I talk to older people, there's lots of other different types of ways that mobility can be achieved that don't always mean that you have to literally go and do the same journey. Interesting part is the potential mobility that's talked about quite a lot. I had older people in some of my groups who keep a car on their driveway but don't use it very often at all, but it's there just in case they need it for something. They say, well, what if my wife goes into hospital? I need to be able to visit her. I don't want to give the car up totally just in case I need to do that. Some people saying they want it for in case it's a lovely day and I then can go for a day out. So the potential for travel is really important. But so too is virtual mobility. So how do you bring mobility to people in their homes? So first of all, the first primary thing to think of is internet shopping, or doing what we're doing now. So being able to bring meetings to people meeting their family and friends online. Of course, the world has gone, you know, crazy with that over the last year and a bit because of COVID restrictions and things like that. But when I talk to older people about that, they really miss some of the concepts of actually going and doing the literal mobility. So some of that kinesthetic experience we talked about earlier is really important. You know, feeling the mobility, seeing the world go on around people as well is really missed. But so is bumping into people, or serendipity, or happenstance. You know, people talked about liking to go shopping in Sainsbury's, for example, because they might meet people in the coffee shop afterwards, or they might see somebody shopping and be able to chat and pass the time of day with them. You can't do that if you're shopping online. And that's really missed out on that. So we really miss some of the benefits if you think about transport being more than A to B if you replace it by virtual means. And finally, imaginative mobility. So some older people I've worked with who have severe mobility restrictions can't get out and about very much at all. You know, how do you bring the outside in to help people still connect to the outside? And I did a good study about people's views from their window in their home and how important that was for themselves to connect with their outside, to watch other people's mobility, to watch that world going on around them, as well as using stories about seeing television programs, watching the news. How do you bring those outside things into people? But at the end of the day, there's still really important things about literal mobility missing from those kind of elements. And that's really crucial as we, you know, think about how we replace some mobility. So in a sustainable society, we're reducing mobility, trying to get people to travel less. What do you miss from that? And is there any way we can enhance that? Is really important. But my final just before I move to a conclusion is just to think about a solution at the end of the day, that we've got to think about transport mobility being in relation to people. It's, you know, too often thought about in terms of machines, about infrastructure, about technologies, but it's much more than that. When you work in the transport world, you're often working with engineers. At best, you're working with social scientists such as economists, and that's absolutely fine. That's, of course, it's vital to getting people out and about, but it's not the only you know, it's not the only way of looking at these things. These kind of people get lots of funding, lots of research funding, lots of ways of implementing things at the end of the day, but it's a very positivist background to things. It's very reductionist, it's very number based, and it's easy to see how if you use these approaches, you just need more and more of the same kind of things in order to get people to behave the way that they do. So you end up with more roads, you end up with trying to encourage people to drive more, you end up with autonomous vehicles at the end of the day, without thinking about what is it we really want from our mobility, and what is it that's really important about, what's the essence of mobility that's really important to people. So that's why you've got to take a more multidisciplinary approach involving social science that looks at people, so psychology, cultural geography, sociology. The new mobilities turn brings this all together in a slightly post-positivist kind of approach. Traffic and transport should be viewed as a social situation where road users interact to influence each other. Back from 2000, Hagland and Albury. Must not be based on an erroneous model of humans as abstract rational actors isolated from their social context and operating on purely objective criteria. O'Connell, 2002. We've really got to put people at the heart of how we design our transport systems and how we try and encourage people to think about different mobility options as we age. You know, research I've done with people on public transport, whether it's on trains, community transport, on public bus, as it is in this example, the most crucial thing to getting that journey done and doing that journey well for older people is the driver at the end of the day. Driver empathy, driver understanding, driver awareness, just passing the time of day with the older person on the bus makes a huge difference, makes them feel secure and safe. And again, perhaps, you know, I'm using older people as an example, but it's probably the same for all of us. It just becomes more important for older people who might be less confident about their physical needs, their gait, the way that they're standing, their tiredness, things like that. So driver awareness on the bus, but it's also about human awareness in general. Same when you're designing spaces. Of course, we've got to design accessible and safe space for people to walk. Attractive spaces, though, are important as well. We've created too many spaces that look like those at the top of the diagram, and we need to move towards more at the bottom end of the diagram. We've got to create spaces where people want to come and be part of it, that are interesting, that, you know, pull people to it. There's that selfie bench again at the top left there. So we move from, all right, producing functional spaces, but we don't do that very well, but also attractive and desirable spaces at the end of the day. And those spaces need to be human, like I said, spaces to bring into account those things that people tell me that are so important about mobility that they miss, particularly again over the last year and a half where mobility hasn't been as easy to do. But you know, places for social interaction, spaces to pause, places for happenstance, to watch people going by, to watch the world go by, so that you can see things happening in relation to yourself going on around you. The study, again, to bring this home, was a study I did with people with dementia, living independently, getting out and about in their own local area, and how they navigated that local area so that they were able to complete the journeys they want to do. Some of them doing it independently, some of them do it with family members or with carers. But they really talked about the importance of that space at a human level. So they talked about their navigation around a town or a village through the names of buildings, through things that happened in the events or in a square, or things that happened in those places a long time ago. You know, in Swansea, people were telling me, well, I know where to turn right because it's next to the Woolworths building. It hasn't been Woolworths for 15 years, but that's how people called it, that space, and saw it. And places that were very significant to themselves. You know, so it's all very well having these maps that have road names and things like that on them. People didn't always know those, but they knew the places by somewhere they used to work, somewhere they used to be, they called home, their old school. I had an older couple who went out and about and always walked past the cinema, that's now a bookshop, because that's where they first had their first kiss, you know, 50 years ago. So that was significant to them, despite one of them living with sort of early onset dementia. So they really wanted those anchors and significant buildings to be part of their help them make the place feel more, well, they were able to use the space in a much more confident manner because they were able to navigate by these things, but they're human related things at the end of the day. If we want to improve things, we've got to make more of the social capital, make more perhaps co-production, co-development with older people in those spaces themselves. Older people tell me they want more involvement with their transport planning and their transport environment, but they don't get those opportunities to do so. And I think we overlook the experience and the contribution that older people can make to that, and we need to do more of that. So how do we go about mobilizing that older people's expertise and their brilliance in order to shape the environment moving forward? There are some examples of it. Down the bottom there is the graffiti grannies from Manchester. They started by identifying where there was graffiti in their local area and getting the local authorities to get rid of it or to clean it up, and now they've moved to potholes, and now they're doing pavements that are dangerous as well. So they mark them, phone their local authority and do that. But you know, in this day and age of new technologies, there are better ways of doing that. Can we map it online with Google Maps? How do we get more involvement of people in shaping the transport environment, I suppose, and designing solutions to those issues, and getting more involved in the governance and the policy and practice? Absolutely crucial to use their experience. But just to conclude, transport is partly about getting from A to B, but that's not the whole story. We need to think about that when we redesign mobility for an aging population. It's ultimately a social endeavor. So much of what people told me about is about the social encounters that happen, that people relate to other people in those spaces. It involves that very psychosocial aspects of mobility, of independence, of freedom, and things like that. And if you take away the car at the moment, people feel very much a lack of having those things still part of their lives. So it involves aesthetic aspects as well, those wider things about life going on. And really, at the end of the day, you've got to remember that the journey is as important as the destination. And I think we forget that quite often. So it isn't just a functional endeavor. We've got to put the fun back into mobility and look at those elements rather than just thinking it in terms of functionality at the end of the day. So transport, just to finally conclude, it's about people at the end of the day. It's so often overlooked by our policy makers and practitioners who've got the power to make these differences. Solutions need to understand how people act and how they behave in these spaces, and to involve older people in decision making and design so that we can make a greater transport environment for us all as we age. And that's where I finished. So thank you
Okay,
very much.
thank you very much, Charles. I'm going to look at the chat board if people want to start threading some questions. So first question is, if you have any information why older women are particularly at risk of harm as pedestrians.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Some of the studies again have talked about older people, particularly older women, having more trouble, being more frail and being more like that. But I think they're looking at the data. There's actually more to it than that. It's a bit like that when they cross a road, that older women, quite naturally, as part of an ordinary part of aging, walk slower than the Department of Transport wants them to. But they also walk slower than men. And I just don't think we create an environment where we create an environment for women, full stop. It even comes out, doesn't it, recently about crash test dummies and cars, that they're designed for sort of an average male height. And the seatbelt going across where the man sits and things like that. And you design your car based on that. So women are excluded in a lot of elements about the transport environment, and older women even more so. And I mean, those figures are stark and really need to be addressed. So it's about, I suppose, involving more older women in helping how we design these things.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Catherine Dean has written, how can we encourage councils, etc., to install or retain light-controlled crossings, often being removed and replaced with just zebra crossings, which feel a lot less safe for older and visually impaired pedestrians? Yeah,
there's no easy answer to that other than, again, getting more involvement of older people in these kind of things. There's a great video. I'll try and chat in a minute. When I've finished, I'll put it in the chat. There's a great video put together by some older people in London lobbying Boris Johnson, who was mayor at the time when they did the video, trying to get more appropriate crossings happening. But that's what it's come to. It's come to older people themselves, a bit like the graffiti grannies, having to come together to try and lobby for change. But there ought to be a better process for that to happen, where we can feed more directly into local councils. My work with some really enlightened local councils would really welcome that move and have more involvement of older people in these things. I just think people aren't making these decisions to deliberately exclude older people. They just don't know that it's that important to older people. And you're right, the older people I work with, zebra crossings are the least attractive element to cross the road, because, well, apart from there being no crossing at all, because they feel that cars might not be able to stop. And again, if you're younger and fitter, you've got this idea that you could speed up your crossing or trot across if you're a little bit anxious about a car coming or something like that. You just can't do that in later life. And again, just as part of a very ordinary, for everybody's aging process, and we're just not creating the right kind of environment. If you think at the end of the day, in this day and age as well, it's stupid that we have to press a button at all to cross the road. Why don't the cars get a red light default until they drive up to it, like you would do, I don't know, raising a barrier in a car park place, and default is that people cross the road until a car comes. I think it's we place pedestrians lower down the hierarchy and older pedestrians even further down the hierarchy as a result. There's some examples of some good technology that can be used if you want to extend the crossing. There's a card people use in Singapore. There's Neatbox in Scotland that's being trialed. If you have it on your mobile phone, you press a button instead of having to press the beg button, as it's called, to cross the road. And it gives older people then, or it gives the crossing a little bit longer time for the green man to be on, and then older people get a little bit longer to cross. So there is some moves afoot, but it's a little bit piecemeal and it's all a bit small scale.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Well, related to experience in other countries, Wendy Hardeman asks, what can we learn from other countries in terms of good practice to increase mobility among older people?
Yeah, I think that, again, there's just small little examples here and there that work really well. I think it's just about, some of the examples you get from places like Sweden and Denmark, where older people have a little bit more say in their transport environment, not always, but a little bit more in some of the local authorities. They have to be deliberately consulted. In this country, we we deliberately consult on people who've got disabilities, and you know, different types of disability now, but we don't tend to consult on just older people in general. And they tend to be quite a small, narrow group of people that are often consulted. And I think, again, if you look at some of the Scandinavian countries, they do that as a matter of course a lot better. So there's more involvement of older people in shaping those decisions. And then you get good examples in cities and urban areas, at least, where you've got joined up pavements and things like that. And even better provision of community transport, or specialist transport services, as they talk about there. And a little bit better governance models of those. Again, in the UK, we tend to leave that very much to the market, or to third sector or charities providing these things. So it's often, you know, there's good, really good examples of community transport provision, but it tends to be, you know, down to one or two individuals who've won some money, know how to play the system and win the you know, proposals to put these things on. And then if one of them leaves, it disappears, or you know, another area can't put the same amount on because it doesn't have the people with the resources to do that. So you ended up with a very fragmented system. And again, there's some examples from Scandinavian countries where that's a little bit more joined up between different authorities, which just end up, you know, providing a better example. And the public realm in places like France and even places in Spain, Greece and Italy, where there's more thought about public space and more places for people to be part of those spaces. You do see more older people using those, with more benches and things like that. So there's some good examples, but lots of little fragmented examples, I suppose.
Okay, again, I'll invite anybody, if they've got any questions, to please put them in the chat function. While I'm waiting to see if there's any more, could I pose a question, Charles? I mean, you've covered quite a wide range of areas. You've talked about pedestrians, you talked about the importance of car travel and what it brings in terms of aesthetics, joy and other pleasures. If I had to sort of put you on the spot and say, what would you, is there one particular aspect or one particular policy which you think the UK could really benefit from? What would it be?
Well, that's a tricky one. I think, you know, there's a catch-all one in the first, is to say definitely just more involvement of older people in the shaping and planning of places, and perhaps more involvement of people, full stop. There's a great report in Scotland from the Scottish government, trying to look at how people might be more involved in transport planning decisions and things like that. And like I said, there's you know, enlightened transport planners want that to happen. They want more involvement. They want to understand how people operate and how they work in these places. So that comes out as the key aspect in the first instance. But really, you know, if you want a local example, it would probably be just about making sure we map where people want to be able to walk, particularly, and provide good infrastructure for that. We have such poor, you know, pavement quality, not joined up, broken pavements, or, you know, people not being able to cross in the right locations and things like that. It would make a big difference. And the Welsh government is trying to do that with its active travel bill. The local authorities have to map their walking and cycling routes and have to identify where there's gaps and how they'll provide for those moving forwards, which is a start, at least in the first instance, to be able to do that, because it makes a difference for us all. But it makes a huge difference if you're not so confident on your feet to be able to have, you know, a place off road to be able to walk.
Okay, thank you. Peter Curtis has written in. He says, I was taken by the example of people with cognitive impairment being able to remember locations based on their historic knowledge. Have any studies assessed the utility of overlaying those reflective accounts over current maps? I
think that's a great idea. I think I've tried to think about developing a project. You know, it's in mind about how we might do that. How do we overlay, for example, Google Maps with people's own mapping at the end of the day? There might be some things that people can share then at that subjective level about a local area, like an old theatre, or calling that building the old Woolworths building, or something like that. But there also might be things that people have that are very related, to themselves, like where they had their first kiss, or where they first worked in that town, or something like that. But it would be useful to have a facility to be able to map that, wouldn't it, at the end of the day? So I totally agree. I don't think there's anything out there at the moment that that has done that or looked at that, but it would be a great idea. I agree.
Okay, thank you very much. Don't know if anybody's got any final question, but if you want
Paul,
to...
do you mind if I chip in? Just
sure.
ask. Yeah, Charles, fabulous talk. Thank you very much for that. I have one question about, car owners for their entire life versus people who've never owned a car, and your sort of confidence and competency in older life of navigating transport systems. Has there been any research done on that? And is there any kind of merit in people who haven't owned a car to be able to share knowledge with people who are suddenly losing the ability to drive a car, and sort of the power of that as an approach?
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on. Yeah, people who've got, it's almost like having a mindset that's around the public transport and knowing how to go on, knowing what the norms are, understanding the timetables and things like that. It's one of the reasons why older women give up driving better than older men, because they're more likely to have been multimodal throughout their life. Men have the privilege of using the vehicle most often throughout their life, or get the primary vehicle in a family. And it's changing a little bit now, but that's how it's been for the older people. So they've used that to go to work, whereas the older women have used the car intermittently, had to use public transport, used other modes, active travel modes as well, walking and cycling throughout their life course. So they're more likely to be able to give up driving a lot easier, and they use these other modes, particularly again if they do that earlier on in their later life. And yes, there's a little bit about, there's been some bus buddying kind of schemes where people who use the buses more regularly and confident users help other people on, on and off the buses and things like that. And some really good successful examples of that around the country. But again, quite often, some people don't want to be bus buddied. I'll be fine, I'll go along, and then, don't actually manage to do it or don't get round to it. So yeah, but there's some good examples of that happening. But yeah, it's having that sort of mindset.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard Clark has suggested that he knows of a company in Belgium that does this mapping of old photos onto current townscapes.
Brilliant.
And he says that this Belgian company did this specifically to support older people's use of memory to navigate and hold memories, so to react to it. So yeah, somebody's out there is thinking about it.
Excellent. Yeah, it'd be great. Exactly, that would be brilliant. Older people talk quite often about wanting to, or their memories about places and collecting those together. There's a good charity called Book of You that do individual autobiographies, but they've just started doing ones about towns or places and collective autobiographies using old videos and old maps and old photographs to put them together to make one sort of book about that specific location that's very pertinent to the older people in the area. But it hasn't actually been used to for people to navigate their way around an area. But it'd be great. Yeah. So yeah, Richard, if email me, that would be great to chat to some more about that. That'd be really good.
Okay, that's wonderful. Great. I think we've covered everything in terms of the questions. There aren't any more, but just to say great thanks for doing this presentation today. We can't wait for you to come to Norwich and take you to the Waffle House. I'm sure older people will remember it as well, because not a lot changes, fortunately, too often. So we all have a lot of memories where buildings are. So thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
I'm going to hand over to Wendy Hardiman now, who's going to carry on the theme of talking about mobility. And this is on the Propels trial. I'm going to invite Wendy to talk about promoting sustained increase in physical activity in an at-risk population. So Wendy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the kind introduction. I'm just going to share my slides, and I hope they're visible to everyone. So, great presentation by Charles, and my presentation is also about physical activity, and mobility, for that matter, and taking a quite different approach. So this is a more individual level intervention to promote sustained increases in physical activity in an at-risk population. And this is a population of people who are at high risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And we know that physical activity, increasing your physical activity, can prevent or delay the onset of type 2 diabetes, irrespective of people's body weight. So PROPELS, PROPELS was conducted in 2 sites. We've recruited participants from the East Midlands and the East of England. PI was Kamlesh Kunti from University of Leicester. The trial was funded by the NIHR Health Technology Assessment. And if you're interested in reading the findings of this study in more detail, we published the findings in BMC Medicine earlier this year. So we all know that adopting a new behavior can be difficult, becoming more physically active, but maintaining increases and activity over time is even more challenging. And so this trial was really trying to look at whether we could develop and evaluate an intervention that helped people not only to become more physically active, but also sustain the changes over a 4-year period. And in this trial, we tested whether annual group sessions where people used pedometers, step counters to increase their walking, and this is an existing program called Walking Away, whether that program was able to achieve sustained increases with or without tailored text messages and phone calls. And I'll explain the interventions in more detail soon. So this is the study design. We recruited anyone who had a record, or in the primary care records, a blood glucose measurement that indicated that they were in the pre-diabetes range. So that meant that they were at a high risk of developing diabetes in the next few years. And it was a really large study. We included 1,366 adults in our trial, and the median age was 61 years old. On average, participants were in the obese range. Their activity was about 6,638 steps per day. They were fairly active as a population. Half of them were women, and 28% were participants from Black and minority ethnicity. And we specifically set out to recruit a multi-ethnic sample, which we managed to achieve. The key outcome of our study was physical activity measured as steps per day. And this was measured by wristwatches, which we call accelerometers. And we measured the key outcome at 4 years after the start of the intervention. And we managed to retain the participants really well in the study. We had physical activity data from the accelerometers available for more than 3/4 of the participants, both at 12 months and at 48 months when we did all the measures. So the PROPELS study had 3 groups to which people were allocated by chance. The first group was the control group, and they received a leaflet that gave them advice about physical activity and the importance of physical activity in preventing or delaying the onset of type 2 diabetes. Our second group, Walking Away, was our first intervention group. And in this group, the participants were invited to attend annual group sessions, about 2.5 to 3 hours in length. And we had 4 of these group sessions over the course of the intervention. And finally, our most intensive intervention was Walking Away Plus. So participants here were invited to take part in the group sessions, the 4 annual group sessions. In addition to that, they received phone calls 1 week and 6 months after each of the group sessions, and they also received tailored text messages. And I'll give more detail now about the 2 intervention groups. So the Walking Away group sessions were delivered by 2 trained facilitators, and the groups included up to 10 participants, and participants were also invited, if they wanted to bring someone along to the group session. And in the group session, the key aims were to increase people's knowledge and their perceptions of risk factors for type 2 diabetes, so primarily physical activity, but there was also some focus on diets as on healthy diets as a risk factor. And in the group sessions, we aim to increase people's self-efficacy, their confidence to become more active, and also what we call outcome expectations. So their beliefs about sort of trying to instill positive beliefs about becoming more active. And the strategies that we used in the group session were encouraging participants to set goals to become more active and to make a detailed plan of where, when, and how they wanted to increase their physical activity. And we asked them to monitor the progress with how they were getting on. And everyone received a pedometer, which is a very simple step counter, which they could use to monitor the steps walked per day. And sort of the target overall of the group sessions was to increase step counts by up to 3,000 steps per day from sort of the baseline count. And that's equivalent to about half an hour of physical activity per day. So in the Walking Away Plus group, the participants received the group sessions, but had a phone call 1 week after each group session where they sort of talked with the facilitator more about setting more individual, personalized goals for becoming more active, making detailed plans. Also, their confidence for becoming more active was rated, and problem solving was done if people perceived any barriers. And then participants received access to a text messaging program. So for the first 2 months, they received about 1 to 3 text messages a week. And those text messages encouraged the participants to monitor their step counts with a pedometer and text it in. And they then received tailored feedback on how they were getting on based on their goals, their confidence level, and also previous activity levels. And they were also sent problem-solving texts, which I'll give an example of in a moment. And then between 2 and 6 months, they received 1 text message a week. Again, tailored text messages to their beliefs and their confidence, and use of the behavior change strategies like goal setting and action planning. And then before the 6 months phone call, they were asked to self-monitor their step count for 1 week and text it in. During the 6 month phone call, the facilitator gave the participants feedback on how they were doing, their progress, reviewed the goals with the participants, and prompted them to set ongoing goals for the next 6 months. Also, the facilitator talked about problem solving any barriers, highlighted the importance of social support, and also the benefits of becoming more active. And then again, between 6 and 12 months, there was 1 text message a month, again, tailored. And prior to the group session, text message to prompt people to self-monitor for 1 week and then text in their step count again. So these are a few examples of the text messages. On the left-hand top, there is a text message that prompts people to text in their weekly step counts and by entering the number of steps they had achieved over the past week. And then just under that, you can see an example of a text message that rewards people when they had actually achieved their goal. On the top right, there is a text message that prompts people to repeat the activity and sort of link it to a stable context. And we know that really helps to make physical activity a habit. And on the right bottom, there is an example of a problem-solving text. So asking people what barriers they experienced, and then they got a tailored text message depending on the answer. So this is a very busy slide. I'm not going to talk through the details, but it just shows you that we screened over 1,500 participants for inclusion. As I said, we randomized 1,366. They were well balanced over the 3 groups. And just to highlight that we had good retention of the participants at both at 12 months and 48 months follow-up. So this is the engagement of the 2 intervention groups with the intervention. In both groups, about 80% of the participants attended the first group session. And about 70% of participants in both groups attended at least one of the follow-up sessions during the 4 years. And in the Walking Away Plus group, 3/4 of participants registered with the text messaging service, and 85% received at least one telephone call during the trial. So I think engagement was quite pretty comparable with other sort of real-world diabetes prevention studies, for instance, the NHS Diabetes Prevention Programme. So these are the key the findings of the trial. I'll just talk you through it. So I'm just going to focus on the left-hand diagram, which shows total physical activity, and there is a dotted line there, a vertical line, and if the horizontal lines are to the right of it, it means that there is a positive effect of the intervention. So as you can see, if we start at the top row, row at 12 months, Walking Away group had a higher, walked more steps per day than the control group, whereas there was no difference at 12 months for the Walking Away group versus control group. So the intervention had a positive effect only for people who received the group sessions, the phone calls and the text messaging at 12 months. But as you can see, at 48 months, that increase was not sustained. There was no difference between the Walking Away Plus group versus the control group, and also not for the Walking Away versus control group at 48 months. So the initial increases in the Walking Away Plus group were not sustained at 4 years. And these are some data about, we asked the participants, because we taught them to encourage them to set goals, to make plans for becoming more active, and to wear the pedometer. And here you can see how often people, the proportion of participants who reported that they used those strategies some or most of the time. And so the first 3 columns are the data at 12 months, and the final 3 are at 48 months. I think the key message here is that the participants in the Walking Away Plus group were more likely to say than the participants in the Walking Away group that they wore the pedometer, and also that they kept an exercise log. So there might have been some impact of those text messages prompting them to monitor their step count and text them in. If you look sort of the top 2 lines, there aren't any real differences between the 2 intervention groups, at least in the proportion of people who said that they set goals to become more active and made detailed plans. So small differences, but those are quite similar. So in conclusion, we found the trial showed that a group-based intervention combined with text messaging and telephone support resulted in modest but clinically meaningful changes in physical activity at 12 months. And the difference there was about 500 steps per day, which is sort of equivalent to 8 minutes per day walking, and that's clinically meaningful. But unfortunately, however, those changes were not sustained at 48 months. We embedded a qualitative study in the trial, and I haven't had the chance really to say a lot about it, but it was very clear that 4 years is a very long time, and participants reported all sorts of life events, like having an injury or having to go into hospital, or other life events that really made them much less active, and they didn't really recover from those events. So I think there's something about interventions needing to support people when they need to deal with when they're dealing with changing circumstances or changing contexts. And really, to come back to Charles' really excellent talk, individual level interventions can only achieve that much, and it's absolutely vital if we want to increase physical activity at the population level that we have got supportive environments for people in which to do so. And we know, and Charles highlighted that very clearly, that the physical environment, the built environment, our social environments, what other people around us think and do, and also socioeconomic factors are huge, very important influences on physical activity. So we really need more than just individual level interventions to increase physical activity at the population level. So that was my talk. Thank you for your attention, and I'll stop sharing and for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Wendy. I thought that was a very nice point to conclude on, and the overlap between yourself looking at individuals as well as the aspects that Charles was talking about from a policy perspective that affects us as a society. Okay, so I'm looking forward to some questions, please, if you want to put them into the chat function. So I'm just going to wait for them to come through. While I'm waiting there for them, I think Peter Curtis is about to write something. My question comes really at the end. This aspect of 4 years, as you say, I mean, a lot can happen to elderly people in a 4-year period, and that obviously, you know, may disrupt their original intentions. But beyond that, do you think that there's a possibility that actually you do need to mix it up in some sense? So, you know, to revitalize interest, maybe the nature of the intervention has to change, maybe annually, just to sort of take a different approach, perhaps, to sort of spike some interest, if you think that one of the factors may be that interest just waned over time.
That's a really good point, Paul, and I think that might, you know, that could have been the case. And I think there was some feedback from our participants there, particularly about the group sessions, that they felt, you know, sort of they got most out of it from the initial group session and didn't really feel the need to come back. And I think our text messages were tailored, but then again, they, yeah, I think there's lots more new technology out there that can make, you know, where, you know, mobile systems can learn more about the individual and can really tailor the support more to changing context and changing behavior over time, which we weren't able to do. I think it's the trial started in 2013, and it's just quite incredible to look back at our leaflets that we had of people, you know, with the old Nokia phones, and it was just amazing what happened over the course of the trial, and you know, smartphones being introduced, and obviously, you know, people started to use other technology as well, and I'm sure that happens in our control group as well, you know, where people got smartphones and smartwatches and started to use apps. So there's a lot of change, and I think that's quite a challenge when you do a trial where everything has sort of got to be nailed down at the beginning, to sort of adapt to the changing context, both for the participant and our digital environment.
Thank you very much for that, Wendy. I'm sure you've made us all reminisce fondly of the good old days when we used your phones. Probably. So talking about technology, Peter Curtis has written in to ask about several questions, but first of all about the text messages. Were they AI? So how were they, how were they organized and delivered? And did the 10 people per group remain the same during the 4-year period, or was there some changes? And also you had 25% loss of participants at year 1, and this was the same at year 4. So what were the characteristics of those dropping out at year 1? Is there's something that's common across those groups? So some technical questions from Peter.
Yeah, good questions, Peter. The text messages, I mean, the technology wasn't there at the time, so we certainly didn't use AI. We developed a huge library of text messages, and I forgot to say that there's a paper which I think I cited on one of the slides. So there was a lot of development work and qualitative research being done where we developed text messages and piloted them with participants. So we had a huge library of text messages, but the technology wasn't there to sort of, you know, really tailor. I mean, it was tailored, the feedback that people received on their, the step count was as tailored as it could be. But I'm sure if we do the intervention now, it could be far more personalized and tailored. Just looking at the chat box, because there are some more questions as well. If the drop off, all right. I'm just going back to there's quite a few questions about, the 10 people per group, they didn't remain the same over the 4 years. So we had people coming, some people came first 2 years and other people then came again at 3 years. So they weren't stable groups over the time. And there are lots of participants. I can't sort of remember, Peter, I'm sorry. I don't think there are lots of participants 1 year. Yeah, actually, I don't remember exactly the detail of whether those 25% lost at 1 year were the same as those of 4 years and the characteristics of those dropping out. But yeah, the trial paper will provide some detail on that, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you. Anne-Marie asked the question about whether you conducted any exploratory subgroup analysis to identify responsive subgroups that this approach might work for.
Yeah, good question, Anne-Marie. We did some subgroup analysis and we didn't find any differences, I think, in intervention effects, as a function of age or gender. I think what we did find was that people, of lower socioeconomic status benefited less from the intervention. So again, a really, really important message.
Peter Curtis also asked about what happened with the intermediary years. So did you have data for years 2 and 3? I mean, is there a line that can be drawn across each of the years, or did you just analyze years 1 and 4?
Yes, we did. We didn't do annual accounts. It's probably to do with participants' burden. So no, we haven't got any data, how from the accelerometers. We didn't do accelerometry measurements at years 2 and 3. And yeah, that's always with hindsight. You would have liked to see, how the trend was over time. But no, we haven't got that. And it could, I think there is, always age-related decline in physical activity as well. So our participants, which I forgot to mention, were between 40 and 74 years old. So not really older adults. And they were 25 to 74 years old for those from an ethnic minority group. So a slightly younger age group.
Okay, Mark Kiesel mentions that we have the Moves app here at UEA that is useful for staff and students to use that knowledge of your findings to help inform our development of that particular app. So there's an opportunity, I think, to explore.
Great, thank you, Mark. I'll certainly follow that up. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if we've got any final questions. We have literally 1 minute to go. If anybody's bursting to ask, now is your opportunity. Okay, not at the moment, but lots of thank yous beginning to emerge. So I think at that point, Wendy, we'll conclude it. And just to thank you for a really interesting talk along with Charles. I thought the 2 talks really dovetailed very well together. So we can't thank you enough. Thank you very much for that. And also to remind everybody, we have a December seminar that will be by Dr. Julian Brown of Prescription Services Limited and a GP at Litcham Health Centre. And that talk will be on data integration for optimal patient care. So I want to thank our speakers again. So wonderful talks. And also thank you very much for the questions on the chat function. And also thank you for Zoom for actually working and not letting us down today. So thank you, everybody. And Charles, that offer of coming over to eat at the Waffle House is still open to you anytime you want to visit. Okay.
Great. Thank you,
everybody. It's been wonderful having the seminar, and I hope you've all thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much, everybody.